Now
okay.
we are. Sorry about that.
Got it. All right. So faster reporting is a big reason for doing this. You're also going to do this for things like drag and drop reporting. So drag and drop reporting. What that allows you to do is easily let your users build out their own reports. So rather than you having to build every single one of the reports that your users want through whatever reporting tool it may be business objects, it may be reporting services, whatever the tool is, that's an IT tool. And that means IT developers or report developers are having to create the reports. And really what you'd like to do is push some of that workload into your users' queue. Right now, I'm sure if I ask many of you, you tell me that you have dozens and dozens of reports that are waiting for you to develop or waiting for someone on your team to develop when they go back to work, when they get off their lunch break here. But what Analysis Services allows you to do is set up an environment that allows your users to easily create their own reports and through a tool that they usually want to see their data in anyways, which is Excel. So you're going to build out these Analysis Services cubes, your users connect to those Analysis Services cubes in Excel, and start building their own reports. It saves you a lot of time. Usually it's what they want anyways, because if you've ever built any reports in any tool, the first thing your user is going to ask for is, how do I export this into Excel? So why not give them the capability to connect to it directly? And that's one of the big benefits Analysis Services is going to give us. The other thing that Analysis Services will help us with is centralizing some of our logic that we have. So what I mean by that is any kind of formulas that you're going to have to write out. Things like I need to be able to calculate profit, or I want to be able to calculate last year's profit. Any of those kind of calculations that I'd like to be able to have prepared for my users, I could store inside of an Analysis Services cube. So I can pre-store that information, and rather than my user having to calculate that on their own inside of a report or inside of Excel, I can store that inside of the cube, and that logic is made so all they have to do is drag and drop that into a report. So it's just a little field that they drag and drop using pivot tables. So it's saving them a lot of time, and you're ensuring that that formula is done right because you've stored it in the cube. Now, that formula is created using a query language called MDX, and if you've briefly even looked at Analysis Services before, you've probably seen MDX and may have been pretty intimidated by it. It's a difficult language to pick up. And a lot of the reason why it's a difficult language to pick up is because we're coming from a background, most of us are coming from a background of things like T-SQL. And T-SQL, while it may look similar to MDX in some ways, is actually quite different. So it can be confusing to people that are new to it. Luckily, there's not a whole lot of MDX that you have to write with the basics of cube design. If you have a lot of complicated formulas, then sure, you probably have to write a lot of MDX. But generally speaking, you'll have pretty simple MDX queries, and we'll talk about that. Probably won't have time to show a lot of that in this 1 hour session. We certainly do have a MDX webinar on the Pragmatic Works website. You can go look at some of the older ones there. All right, so hopefully this kind of gives you an idea and an overview of why you would want to do Analysis Services. Now, I have this in my slide here as well. So we talked about faster reporting, drag and drop reporting, and centralizing logic. There's reasons why you would do Analysis Services, but I think that graphical depiction helps build out what it would be as well. All right, now if you're new to Analysis Services, you may or may not realize this, but there are multiple versions of Analysis Services. Now, in this session, we're focused in on Analysis Services Multidimensional, but you also have really these 4 different layers of Analysis Services. And it starts all the way back down here at the Power Pivot side, which a lot of people don't think of as a version of Analysis Services, but it actually is. It's a version of Analysis Services that is built into Excel. So if you have Excel 2010 or higher, you can do Power Pivot, and it's a version of Analysis Services that you can do just on your desktop and in the Excel environment. Now, as you can tell from the graph here, it's the least scalable of all of these because it's relying on the resources of your laptop or your desktop, but it's also the quickest to learn, and it's the quickest to results. You get the quickest bang for your buck with Power Pivot if you're just trying to create a quick and simple solution. Power Pivot for SharePoint, that next level up. Power Pivot for SharePoint allows you to scale out a little bit what you can do in Power Pivot. So rather than using the resources of your laptop, you deploy a Power Pivot workbook to SharePoint. Once it's deployed into SharePoint, it uses the resources of a server that's behind the scenes. There's actually an Analysis Server behind the scenes that's doing all of the processing for Power Pivot workbooks that are inside of SharePoint. That also helps you with doing things like scheduling data refreshes for Power Pivot workbooks. Next one up, Analysis Services Tabular. Analysis Services Tabular came out in SQL Server 2012. This is the server version of Power Pivot. And a lot of people don't realize this, but if you spend some time learning Power Pivot in Excel, you pretty much also learn Tabular. There's very few differences between Power Pivot in Excel and Analysis Services Tabular. One is developed in Excel, that's Power Pivot, whereas Tabular is developed in the Visual Studio environment that developers are more familiar with. So it's very similar to Power Pivot. In fact, you can take a Power Pivot workbook that a developer, or I should say an end user, has created, and you can upgrade it to an Analysis Services Tabular model just by opening it inside of Visual Studio. Now, next month I'll be doing a webinar on Analysis Services Tabular, so you'll get to see a little bit of that. Now, the focus for today is going to be Analysis Services Multidimensional. Again, I mentioned that a moment ago. This tool is by far the most scalable. And the reason it's most scalable above the other tools is because the other tools are very, very reliant on in-memory technology. So it depends on how much memory you can throw at your machine. Whereas Analysis Services Multidimensional, of course, does rely on memory, it also relies on the way that the files store the data. So it's a different methodology of storing the data inside files in a way that returns back the data in a pre-aggregated, faster format. So that's part of the reason why it's the most scalable cube. Kind of the de facto an example for this is which one is the, when you have this large example, in fact, it's Yahoo is the largest example of an analysis service cube. They had a 26 terabyte cube, and when they had to make a decision on which one of these technologies to choose, they choose Analysis Services Multidimensional. So it is the most scalable, but as you can tell from the graph, it's also the most difficult to learn. So clearly in a 1-hour session here, we're going to get just the highlights, but you will definitely want to invest some time if you plan on creating cubes on some training. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the whole scale of what we have available to us. Now, let's talk about some terminology. Now, terminology inside of Analysis Services, a lot of this is going to be new to you if you've never played around with it, obviously. But some of it does translate to existing terminology that you may already be aware of. All right, so first of all, cubes. You hear the term cube a lot whenever you hear Analysis Services. A cube is just a collection of different metrics and dimensions that are brought together. So they have relationships together, so that way you can analyze that data together. Okay, so a cube is just a collection. It's like a bucket of all these metrics and dimension data that you want to analyze. A measured group is basically like a fact table. So if you're comfortable and you're familiar with data warehouse terminology, facts and dimension tables, then a measured group is like a fact table. What that means, if you're not familiar with that, is it stores all the metrics, all the things that you want to aggregate. So price, the quantity, the duration of something, whatever you want to aggregate up or roll up or sum up is stored inside of a measure group. Okay, so a measure group is just a collection of those metrics. Measures are those individual metrics. So measures map out to a column inside of your fact table. Those measures are usually going to be the numeric columns that you want to sum up or aggregate in some way. Okay? So an example of this would be my measure group could probably be my sales table, and then my measure would be something like the tax amount. Okay, so the sales table is that bucket that stores all the measures, and then the measure itself would be something like my tax amount or maybe my quantity. These are different columns that are inside that fact table. Dimensions store the descriptive information about a metric. Okay, so something like if I'm talking about sales data, it may be something like the employee that sold it. Okay, so a dimension table or dimension may be employee. It would be a collection of all the different columns or fields that have to do with an employee. Okay, now an attribute is actually one of those columns. Okay, so if a dimension is a collection of attributes or columns, then an attribute is actually a column. So an example of this would be my employee dimension, my marital status attribute, and then a member is actually a distinct row inside that attribute. Okay, so think of it this way. Let me actually write that on here. This would be like my employee dimension. This would be like my marital status column or attribute. And then the last one here, member. A member is actually a value, a distinct value inside that marital status column. So this would be like single, something like that. Okay? So that's kind of some basic terminology here. Now we're going to get pretty quickly into designing here because I know we only have so much time. We're already 45 minutes left. but I want to get some of the ideas here of what we're going to do before we do it. So I want to tell you what we're going to do, then I'm going to show you what to do. All right, so we got the terminology at least roughly down here. The first things we're going to do is we're going to start setting up things called a data source, which that one should be pretty obvious what that is. We're then going to set up a data source view, and then we're going to use something called a cube wizard to do our initial design. All right, so a data source is just whatever we're trying to connect to. So whatever the data source is that we want to build our cube on top of, which if you remember back to the diagram I had at the beginning of this webinar, that would be our data warehouse. Okay? A data source view is a layer of abstraction between your data source and your cube. So what that means is I may have 100 tables inside my data warehouse, but only 10 of them have to do with what I want to be in this cube. So inside that data source view, I can pick out which tables I want to be part of the cube. I don't have to bring all of them in. Okay? There's some other things you can do in the data source view as well. We'll see that here in a few moments. Then finally, the cube wizard is what we'll use to create our initial design for our cube. Okay? Now I have a few more slides here, but I'm going to come back to those, and let's actually go into our first demonstration here. All right, now I'm actually using, again, this is all going to show 2014 stuff, but like I mentioned, 2014 is exactly the same, other than the environment. It's exactly the same as 2012. And there's actually very, very, very small differences between 2012 and 2008 R2 even. It mainly has to do with the browser window, which I'll show you here in a few moments. All right, now if you're using SQL Server 2014, the development environment that you're going to use for developing Analysis Services Cubes, or really anything in BI, is going to be something called SQL Server Data Tools. Now this is actually a shell of Visual Studio. And if you're using SQL Server 2014, it's going to be a shell of Visual Studio 2013. Okay, so you can actually see 2013 all over my screen here. That's because it's using the shell of Visual Studio 2013. They've actually separated out the development tool from the SQL Server install because they're going to have much more frequent updates of this now. All right, so by the way, if you're launching this for the first time, I'm using Windows 8 here. I would just type in, let me actually go to my right environment here. I would just type in SQL Server Data Tools, okay, and I would launch the environment here. I've already done that though. I just want to show you that's how you could launch it. You could also go to your Start menu if you're using Windows 7 or below. All right, so I'm going to create a new project here by going up to my File menu and selecting File, New Project. And you'll see that because I have the SQL Server Data Tools installed for BI, I have the development tools for BI available to me here. And if you're familiar with all the BI components, you'll see here that you have Analysis Services as an option, you have Integration Services, as well as Reporting Services as different types of development templates you have available to you in Data Tools. We're going to focus in on Analysis Services, so I'll select Analysis Services here, and then you'll see the options that are available to me for templates I can use for building a cube. Now, like I mentioned, next month I'm actually going to do a webinar on tabular, so I'm going to not touch on these bottom three right now. I'll touch on those next month. But today, we're going to focus on multidimensional. Now, to create a new cube, I can select this top option and give it a name here on the bottom, and it'll create a new project for me for my Analysis Service cube. So I can call this my PW Webinar project. And this project is just a bucket to store all of the files I'm going to create in here. There's another option here, import from server. If I've already deployed previously, I'm going to hit OK here, by the way. If I've already created a cube previously, I could actually regenerate all the source code from that cube if it's been deployed. That's what the import from server option does. All right, now again, this is using Visual Studio 2013. Probably a lot of it looks very similar. There's just a few icon changes here and there, but other than that, it should be basically the same thing as you've maybe developed in previously if you've looked at Analysis Services before. But what we're going to start with on the far right here is by creating a data source. So I mentioned just a moment ago that the first three things we're going to do is create a data source view, and we're going to create a cube wizard, which will actually create both a cube as well as some dimensions. So we're about to knock out 4 things on this list here pretty quickly here. All right. So this is a solution explorer. It's where we find all the files we want to develop. I'm going to create a new data source by right-clicking on Data Sources and selecting New Data Source. This just walks me through creating a connection, basically. So I'm going to point it to a connection that I want to pull my data in from, which will be my data warehouse. So I'll select a new connection here. We'll point it to my server that I want to connect to. Okay. Nothing really fancy here about the connection. Keep in mind you can connect to other types of data sources here. It does not have to be SQL Server. And I'm going to point it to my database, which is the good old AdventureWorks database here. So I'm going to select AdventureWorks and hit OK. All right, I'll hit Next as well. And then the first option that's going to ask me here that's a unique option for Analysis Services is something called impersonation information. What impersonation information is during varying times of development, how is Analysis Services going to connect to the underlying data source? Okay, so how is Analysis Services going to connect to my data warehouse when I try and process the data? Okay, by the way, what process means? That means pull new data into my cube, because it does store the data inside of Analysis Services. So you'll see four options here. What most large companies choose is this top option. And what they'll do with this top option is they'll create a special domain service account for Analysis Services. And that specific account will have the access it needs to process and pull in data from the different data sources. That's what I see most large companies do. Some companies that are just starting out oftentimes choose this inherit option. I'm actually going to choose this as well just to kind of show you what it does. But what the inherit option does is it attempts to choose the best login, the best credentials, depending on what you're doing. Okay, so here's what that means. If I'm processing and pulling new data into Analysis Services, that means that it's going to use the service account that runs the analysis server. So the actual account that runs my server, it's going to use that account to try and pull in new data, which may not be right, but that's what it's going to try and do. And then when I try and do things like drill throughs to the underlying data, then it'll attempt to use things like my credentials that I'm logged in as. Now you can clearly use things like use the credentials of the current user, but keep in mind that this is something you're going to deploy to the server. You probably don't want your credentials embedded in here anywhere, so just be aware of that. And then of course the last option here, use service account. That means again it's going to use the account that is running on the server to pull in the data. All right, so I'm going to use inherit and then hit Next. I'll also name my data source. The default name is fine, and hit Finish. All right, so we've created our data source. Our next step is to create a data source view. You can create a data source view, again, inside the Solution Explorer over here. I can right-click on the data source view folder and create a new data source view. All right, again, it's going to take me through a wizard, so it's made pretty easy for you here. I'll hit Next. Tell it which data source or data sources, so that's an interesting thing. You can actually pull in potentially from multiple data sources, but I can identify which data source do I want to make my data source view based off of. So keep in mind what you could, in theory, do here. I can have the majority of my data warehouse built in SQL Server, a couple tables in Oracle that I want to pull in, and I can merge them together inside of Analysis Services. The one dependency there is you can create relationships. You can create what's called logical relationships inside of Analysis Services between those objects. And of course, the same rules apply. They have to have similar data types, that sort of thing. All right, so I'm going to use Analysis Services DW 2012 and hit Next. And then I can select from a list of the tables that I want to use for this data source view. Now, I happen to know what I want to already pull in here because I'm very familiar with this database. I want to pull in the sales data, so I'm going to bring in the internet sales, and then I can go check off any other tables that I want to include inside the data source view. And again, the reason I'm doing this is these are the tables that are available inside my cube. Okay, so I can go pick on any of the other tables I want, or there's a nice option here called Add Related Tables in the bottom. If I select this Fact Internet Sales table and then come over here and click on Add Related Tables, it'll actually pull in all the other tables that have a relationship to the sales data. Now, of course, that assumes that you actually have relationships. If you're coming from a database that does not have relationships, that clearly does not work. In my case, I do have relationships, so it pulled in a bunch of supplemental tables here. And, so bear with me, guys. I just lost, there we go. I lost my screen for a moment. Let me go back through that. I can catch up real quickly. But it's using those relationships that it found inside my source system to pull in additional tables. Now, if there's tables I don't want, I can just remove them. Whichever ones I don't want to include, I can just double-click on them or click on them and hit an arrow to send them back over to the other side. So just the tables on the right side are the ones that will be included inside my data source view. All right, so I'm going to hit next, and then name my data source view. You can leave it as a default name, or you can rename it. Nobody sees this, by the way, unless they're exploring in the server. So I'm going to leave it as is and hit finish. All right, so you can see this is a data source view. It looks very similar to a database diagram, and that's basically what it is. It's a database diagram showing me all of the tables that I have available to be placed in my cube. So if I start off with a very small cube, like I start off with these 5 tables, and I develop a cube based on these 5 tables, if I ever realize that later I want to add extra tables, I have to start by coming back to the data source view, where we're at right now, and right-clicking in the middle and telling it that I want to add new tables. So anytime you realize that you need to add something new, you always have to make a trip back to the data source view. Okay? Now right now, everything you see here is based off of tables, but ideally, what I usually recommend is that you actually put views on top of these tables. So like SQL Server views on top of the tables that you see here. The reason for doing that is really multiple reasons. One reason for doing that is you probably have a lot of people that understand how to do T-SQL. So you probably work with a lot of people that know T-SQL, but probably not a lot of people that know how to do cubes. So if you put views on top of each of these tables, you have other people that can actually help you develop outside of the cube development area that we're looking at here. So I can have someone else actually add a where clause to a view for me, or add a column to a view for me, and then I can refresh and get those new fields. So that's one reason. The other reason is it will actually help you when you're developing on much larger databases. So if I'm developing on top of a database that has billions and billions of rows, I probably don't want to process those billions and billions of rows every time I need to make a change. So one of the things that happens when I need to make a change inside my cube, I have to reprocess and pull that data in after I make a metadata change. Now, what putting a view on top of my tables will help me do is I can actually add something like a filter to my sales data. And rather than doing my development on all those billions of rows, I can do development on a few thousand rows, and then expose, once I'm done developing, I can expose my cube to the rest of the rows. And I can make a simple change inside my view to be able to do that. So it's a simple where clause in my view to unfilter the data and then bring back all the information I need. The other thing that we want to do here inside this data source view, there's a lot of things we can do, but I want to move forward. The other thing we can do here is I can also add something called friendly names. So right now, all of the tables that you see here have these names like fact internet sales and dim product and dim date. But unfortunately, I have to prepare this for users. Actually, fortunately, because my users are the reason I have a job, I have to prepare this element or this cube for users being able to consume this. And they don't know what dims and fact tables are. So the first thing I really want to do here is rename each of these tables and remove the prefix of dim and fact so that it's not confusing to my users. Now to do that, I can select the table name here, go to the Properties menu just by right-clicking and going to Properties, and then I'm going to move this around a little bit here so I can read it a little better. And then I can give what's called a friendly name to these tables, and it's more of like a usability enhancement here where I apply a friendly name or a usable name for my users. And all I'm going to do here is remove the prefix of dim from the table name. And I'll do that the same for all the tables that we see here. I'll remove dim and fact. I'll put spaces. Spaces are okay here. I'll put spaces where it makes sense to have spaces. And then we're kind of preparing this for our users. Again, I'll add spaces where it makes sense. And then we're off to the races here. All right, so there are a few other things that we can do here, but within the next 30 minutes, we could spend another half an hour on this. So let's actually go to the next step here. Our next step is we're ready to actually use the Cube Wizard. Okay, and what the Cube Wizard does for you is it creates an initial design for both your cube and your dimensions you're going to have inside your final solution here. All right, so to create and use that Cube Wizard I'm mentioning, we're going to go back to the Solution Explorer, which, by the way, if you don't see the Solution Explorer, you can click up top right here, and that'll bring the Solution Explorer up for you. But I'm going to right-click on the Cubes folder and select New Cube, which will launch the wizard for me. I'll hit Next past the little welcome screen here, and the first screen that pops up to me is, how do you want to get started? Okay, so it says, would you like to create a cube using the following options here? The first option, which is what we're going to choose, is use existing tables. Basically what use existing tables means, go look at my data source view and pull tables from that. create an empty cube, literally creates an empty cube, and there's not much point to doing that. And then the final one here is actually generate tables in the data source. And unfortunately, if you don't run a bike store, which happens to be what the two templates are here, if you don't run a bike store, a sales database for bikes, then this template won't be very useful to you. Okay, so you're usually probably 99% of the time you're going to use the existing tables because this is going to point to the tables that we just selected in the data source view. All right, I'll hit next. Now it's going to ask me what is my measure group. So if you remember what our terminology was that we talked about earlier, a measure group is like a fact table or the table that stores all my metrics in it, which in my case is going to be the internet sales table. You'll notice here that it does have a little suggest button, and that suggest button actually looks at the relationships that you have, and based on the relationships, it'll try and make its best guess on which one of your tables is the measure group. In my case here, it was right, but it's not always right. So it's kind of a check and verify thing. You can try it, but make sure you verify that it does it correctly. All right, we'll hit next. All right, next, it's bringing back all of the metrics or the measures that we have inside of that measure group, in this case, my sales table. So it's made its best guess on which of these columns it assumes I want to aggregate and actually do metrics on. Unfortunately, it's not always right. So things like the promotion key, that's just an identity column inside the database. I probably don't want to aggregate on that. Same with currency key. Revision number is just a number that I use to analyze the data. It's not something I want to aggregate. And then I can kind of uncheck and check things that I don't want to or I do want to see here. So these are going to be the measures that I actually see and the numbers that I can aggregate up inside my cube. The other thing here that's worth noting is that Analysis Services automatically puts in this extra metric that's not inside your sales table. It's called an Internet Sales Count measure. And this is automatically placed in every fact table or every measure group that you create, and it's just a count of all the rows you have. So you can use this for things like calculating averages, that sort of thing. All right, so I'll hit next. Try that again. I'll hit next. There we go. And the next step here, and we're almost to the end already, is it's going to ask me which one of my dimensions or which one of my tables do I want to add into my dimensions for my Analysis Services cube. There's a lot of fun things we could talk about here. Just note that I have the tables that are basically underneath these tables here. These are the tables that are inside my data source view, whereas these guys are the dimensions that are about to be created inside the cube. There's not necessarily always a one-to-one relationship here. You could have multiple tables that are inside your data source view that make up a single dimension. For example, we have a product table here, but I could have product, product category, product subcategory all fall under the single Analysis Services dimension called product. That's just up to you how you want to design it. All right, so I'm going to leave this as is and hit next. And finally, name my cube. I'm not so concerned about the name, so I'll leave it as is and hit finish. All right, now you'll see we have several dimensions and cubes that have been now created. One cube, actually. We have one cube and several dimensions that have been created inside our Solution Explorer here on the far right. Okay. Our cube, remember I just kind of named the default name here, but you can name it whatever you want. It's Adventure Works. And then each of the dimension tables that we selected inside the wizard here as well. Now the first thing we're going to talk about is creating hierarchies. So I'm going to slide back over to my PowerPoint for a moment to talk about dimension design. All right, so inside your dimension, you're going to create something called attributes and hierarchies. We already briefly talked about attributes inside my terminology slide. Attributes are basically like columns inside your dimensions. So these are descriptive fields. Okay. Now hierarchies are a collection of these attributes that are placed together. Okay, so think of a hierarchy of your data. I have a couple examples here. Drilling into country, state, city, and customer, there's a natural relationship between the data that are inside those fields. So I may want to create something like a hierarchy out of that data so that it's easier for my users to actually bring in and analyze the results in a report. So basically what hierarchies allow them to do, first of all, it actually helps performance, so it does make the report run faster. I must have a timing on that slide. But it also helps with their usability. So rather than having to drag in country, state, and city individually, it'll actually allow them to just drag in one object, a hierarchy, and it gives them all those fields at once. That's kind of one of the big reasons for doing hierarchies. All right, so let's look at how to do one of those. I'm going to start by going to my sales territory table. Okay. And we're going to create a hierarchy here for my sales territory table, a very basic one. And basically my hierarchy here is going to be my region and my country, and my group here is going to be my hierarchy. Now, as you see here, this is the Dimension Designer. And in the Dimension Designer, you have 3 different panes here. You have a data source view pane, which is just a subset of what our data source view looked like earlier. And these are the tables that are allowed to be part of this dimension. You'll have an attributes pane, which is on the far left, and these are all of the fields that are available to your users, or at least are available to the cube for development. And then in the middle, you have any kind of hierarchies that you may create. Okay? Now for us, we want to create a hierarchy that uses the sales territory region, the country, and the group. Now before I can create a hierarchy out of it, I first have to make these into attributes. So to do that, I can multi-select these 3 columns and drag them over to the far left to create attributes out of each of these 3 fields. Okay, you can see as I drag them over, it automatically made fields or attributes out of them. The other thing that's worth noting here is Analysis Services is pretty smart. It actually looked at the casing inside my column names, and it automatically put spaces in where it thought it made sense to have spaces. So it's pretty smart in that way, where it'll actually look at the data and determine whether it would make sense to have a space there or not. Now certainly I can rename them after the fact. If I don't want to have sales territory prefixing each of these, I could come in here and actually rename each one of these, but it is not mandatory to do that. All right, so now these are just going to be single attributes. And what I'd like to do is create a hierarchy out of these attributes. And the way to create a hierarchy out of them is by clicking and dragging them into the middle pane called hierarchies. Now as attributes, this allows my users to drag in each one of these individually. So they can drag in group individually and country individually. But by creating a hierarchy out of this, it'll actually group all of those attributes together. So whenever my users are creating some Excel pivot tables, they'll be able to drag in one object that gives them all of these fields consolidated into a single view. All right, and we'll try and get a view of what that looks like here in a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in the group, which is going to be the top part of my hierarchy. I'll drag in the country, and I'll drag in the region. And you can see I'm just placing them one right under another, group being my highest level, country next, and region being the lowest granularity here. Now if you make a mistake, you can certainly click and move these things around. There's not a problem. There's not a problem moving them around after you place them here. So if you accidentally place them in the wrong area, apparently you didn't like me doing it this time. Goodness. Wow. That's unusual. Let me see if I can save that here. Of course, I say you can move things around, and as soon as I do, there we go. As soon as I do, I get a nice error box I can't make go away. All right, there we go. So I've created a hierarchy. You can see the hierarchy here appears inside the hierarchies window. And I have a little warning sign that shows up here. So let's look at what that warning is telling us. If you hover on top of it, it tells you attribute relationships do not exist between one or more levels of this hierarchy. And it also tells you, which was really important, the last sentence there, is this may result in decreased query performance. So obviously, I want to do whatever I can to have the best query performance possible. So I'm going to go create these things called attribute relationships. That's the first 2 words there. Now, as you may guess, there's an attribute relationships tab up here in the very top. And that attribute relationships tab is where you'll actually define how each of these attributes are related to each other. And that's basically what you're doing, is saying, how does a group relate to a country, and how does a country relate to a region, kind of thing. Okay? So it's like relationships between individual columns here. So I'm going to work my way over to the attribute relationships tab, and you'll see here that it shows me each of the attributes right now are related to the key column of this dimension. So let me tell you why this is good for performance to do what we're about to do. The reason this is going to help performance is because of this. Imagine I want to go from a group so a group is kind of like a continent here. So I want to go from North America to the Southwest region. Okay, I want to go from here to here. If I wanted to do something like that, the way this would work internally inside of Analysis Services is it would have to drill back over to the sales territory key. It would then go down to country, then back up to sales territory key, then finally back down to region. So a lot of different hops to make it between the group to the region. Where in reality, I should just be able to go here to here and have fewer hops. So that's why this is important for performance. All right, now to create attribute relationships, you always want to ask yourself this. So ask yourself this question whenever you're doing this. What owns this attribute? Okay, so let's start this way. What owns a region? So think of it this way. What owns a region? Well, that kind of makes me think you're asking what is larger than a region? Well, what's larger than a region is a country. So I would click and drag region on top of country. It's a click and drag. Okay? All right, well, what's next here? So what owns a country? Well, a group is above a country, so I would say that a group owns a country. So I'm going to drag country on top of group. Okay? And we're actually done already. So this is showing me how all of these attributes relate together. A region is lower than a country, so you're going from the lowest brain to the highest brain here. A region to a country to a group. Okay? It's kind of backwards from what we saw in the dimension structure. The dimension structure had the highest brain at the top and the lowest brain on the bottom. This one is actually opposite. This one has the lowest brain first to the highest brain. Now there's a few other things we can do in here as well. There's something called attribute type, relationship types. I'm not too concerned about that for what we're doing here right now today, but there are some other things you can learn here as well. Okay. Now we have several other dimensions we can go and play around with. The one other thing I'm going to do in this dimension is I'm going to hide this key column. So this key column is really not very useful to my users. All this key column is just a identity column, and my users are never going to report on that. I have all my relationships inside my data warehouse based on it, but they're never going to actually build any reports off of the sales territory key. So because of that, I'm going to hide it. And to hide an attribute, you can right-click on it, go to Properties, and you're going to change the attribute hierarchy visible property, which is over here. It's kind of falling off my screen here a little bit, but it's right here. You're going to change the attribute hierarchy visible property to false. It's just going to make it where it's still part of the cube, but it's not visible to users, which is what I need for this. I need to still have that column in here for relationship reasons, relationships to the other tables, but I don't necessarily want users to see it, so I'm going to hide it from them. All right, let's process what we have so far. I'm going to go up to the very top here, and I'm going to go to my Build menu, and I'm going to tell it I want to deploy my PW webinar cube. Now, while it's deploying, let me talk about some other terminologies here that are important. Now, it looks like that's going to process successfully. I'll just let that run for a few moments. There's two things you need to be aware of. There is deploying, and there's processing. Let's talk about these things separately. Okay? Deploying is sending out metadata to the cube. So this is like structure changes. Anytime I make a structural change to my cube, I have to deploy. So this is sending structure changes to the server. Okay? Processing has to do with data. Okay? The actual data that's inside the cube. So this is all about sending new data to the server. Okay? So just understand the difference between those two. Oftentimes you'll do both of them at the same time. You'll deploy out metadata changes, and then, I shouldn't say at the same time. You'll deploy first, and then process the new data into the new structures you've created. In our case, you'll see here that our deployment has occurred successfully. It's also done some processing of our data as well. So it actually, you can see here, if you look into this window here, it says processing each of our dimensions. And basically what it's doing when it's doing our processing is if you drill into it, you can see that it's processing in each of our new attributes. So if I were to go look at the dimension we just worked on, the sales territory dimension, I would see exactly what it's doing. It's processing all of the attributes that I have for both country, group, created our hierarchy, processor data for region. And if you really want to see what it's doing here, basically it's doing a bunch of select distincts. You can actually look at the SQL query here, and the query that it's running, oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. The query that it's running is a bunch of select distincts. For each of the attributes that we have, it's running some select distincts against those attributes, so it gives us a distinct list of all of the values that we have. Now here's what it looks like from a cube perspective. You have these little browser windows here that you can use for testing out what you've developed. So if I go to my browser window, I can test out things like my hierarchy. Now, I probably should have named this hierarchy a little better. I called my hierarchy hierarchy. So I could certainly name it something like sales territory drill down or sales territory hierarchy. That's fine for our short demo here. But I can drill into my hierarchy and see each of my sales territory groups. So these are actually my groups. I can drill into a group like North America here, see each of the countries inside that group. I can drill into the country. And then I see each of the regions within inside of that country. So this is my group level. This is my country level. Sorry, right here. Here's my country level. And you can actually see that at the top here. As I click on these, it shows me what the current level is right up top here. So right now I'm looking at country, but if I go and I actually click on something else, like I click on the Southeast region, it'll show me that I'm actually looking at the region level here. Now you can do some other things in here. This is our hierarchy. We can also look at the different attributes we have. We can look at country by itself. So notice no drill through here because it's not a hierarchy. Or I can go all the way down to something like a region level as well and look at all the regions by themselves. Okay? All right, now we've done a process here. Just a few moments ago, we deployed and processed our data. And I want to show you what this gives us the ability to do. Already, we actually have some functionality that we can start looking at here. So to do that, the best way to analyze this data, especially if you're using SQL Server 2012 or 2014 like we are today, the best way to analyze this data is through Excel. Now prior to 2012, you had inside this browser tab a nice little interface that would allow you to pivot the data and interact with the data very nicely inside of Visual Studio. Unfortunately, they replaced that nice little, it was called Office Web Components. They replaced that nice little interface they had previously with this one here that's not very helpful at all. So what you'll see most people do, and what they actually allow you to do here very quickly, is use this little Analyze in Excel button. You see a little Excel button I have at the top here. If I have Excel installed, I can hit Analyze in Excel. It looks like I don't have it on this machine here. But if I had Excel installed, I could actually launch and hit this Analyze in Excel button, and it would allow me to start doing little pivots, like a little pivot table on top of my data that I have. So in the meantime, though, I can use this little browser window and see if I bring in things like the sales amount. Okay, this shows me my total sales amount. Notice there's some formatting things we need to fix here in a few moments. And I can also bring in things like my hierarchy that I have inside of the sales territory table. So inside sales territory, you can see from a user perspective, what the user will see, even in Excel, is they'll see the hierarchy that I created, and then they'll see each of the attributes we created as well. So they could choose to pick individual attributes or columns, or they can bring in an entire hierarchy, and if they bring in that entire hierarchy, it'll actually bring across all those metrics at once. And there's actually performance reasons for doing that as well. Now inside this little UI that we have inside of Visual Studio, it flattens out the hierarchy. But if I were to bring this into Excel, it would actually allow me to drill in. I could see Europe and North America. I could click on North America, and it would expand to show me the countries here, that sort of thing. Okay? Just like you probably have seen in pivot tables in Excel in the past. But look how quickly we've actually got something that's fairly usable. I'm able to start analyzing my sales data. You'll notice the performance is really good. It was able to bring in that data very quickly. And you can also remove it out just by clicking and dragging the fields out. But at any time, I can just drag in these fields and notice how fast the performance is. That's part of the nature of it being pre-aggregated data. Now, one of the things I usually tell people when it comes to analysis services is don't use analysis services for detailed data. Analysis services is built for rolling up data, aggregating data up to higher levels. It's not designed for, and you'll actually see that sometimes it doesn't perform as well at, looking at very, very, very detail level data. And what I mean by that is if you have sales data, for example, like we're looking at now, it's not as good at looking at order line item data. You know, it can roll data up to a day level or roll data up to a month level really well, but when you go to try and look at the lowest granularity of your database, it's not very strong at doing that. And that's not what it's designed for either. In fact, most of the times if you have situations like that or you have reports that you have requirements for that are similar to that where you need to look at the very low granularity, you may choose to either report it directly off of your data warehouse using T-SQL, or the other option would be to still use the cube but use something called an action. Okay? You'll see I have something called an action up here inside my cube tabs. What an action allows you to do is drill through to more detailed data. So in a report that would require that level of granularity, I would give them a rolled up view of it, and they can maybe drill down all the way down to the day level, but if they want to see line items that were sold on that day, they would use an action to go down to that lower level. Because again, a cube is not designed to go down to that super low granularity. All right, now there's a couple other things we could fix in here as well. So you'll notice things like my formatting. So sales amount right now is formatted pretty nasty. We can fix things like that. That's all part of your cube design. The way you'll do that, and I'll talk about this briefly because I want to save some time for questions, at least 5 minutes or so. The way you can actually format the data that you see here is by going underneath the cube structure. Okay? You'll find over here on the far left is each of the measure groups that we have. By the way, you can have more than one measure group in a cube. We only have one right now, which is internet sales. I can drill into my internet sales measure group and select which one of the metrics I want to format. There's a way you can multi-select here as well. The default view doesn't allow you to multi-select, but if I hit this little grid view or measures grid option up top, it'll allow me to multi-select. And the reason you would do that is oftentimes you'll have a bunch of measures that would need to be formatted in the same way. You know, if they all need to be formatted as a currency, I would likely want to multi-select those and format them all very quickly. All right, so let's do that. I'm going to select the sales amount, and I'll go to the properties. My properties window is already open, but if yours was not, you can right-click on this and go to the properties menu. And then from this properties menu, I have a couple things that I can do. First of all, I can tell it that I want to change the formatting here. That's probably one of the more important things is the format string. So I can change and manipulate my formatting here. I can also tell it whether I want this metric to be visible or not. This is an interesting one because a lot of people would ask, you know, why would you make it not visible if you added it to the cube? You would think you just wouldn't add it to the cube if you didn't want it visible. Well, there are some reasons why you would add a metric to a cube and not make it visible. And one of the main reasons is if it was a part of another calculation you were doing. So, for example, if you were creating a calculation for profit, you would take the sales amount minus the cost and make that into a profit calculation. But you may not necessarily want your users to have access to those underlying metrics. Maybe you don't want them to see the cost of your goods. So you could make it not visible to the users, but still use it as part of the calculation. That's why you might make something not visible. There's a lot of other things in here, but one other thing I'll mention right now is you can also put these into different display folders. And basically what display folders allow you to do is organize all your measures. Because as time goes on, you're going to have more and more measures that you create. In fact, already I have 10 or so measures that we've created. And it can get a little difficult to navigate through all these different measures that you create. So that's what display folders help you with. Display folders allow you to create little subfolders for the metrics, so it's easier to find the things you care about. So if I want to look at things having to do with revenue, I might create a revenue folder and place those metrics in that folder. If I want to look at things having to do with inventory, I'll probably create an inventory folder and place those things in that folder. Very easy to create a display folder. All you do here is you type in whatever you want that folder name to be. Like I type in revenue. It's also very simple to create a format string. You can hit the down arrow here and tell it how do you want to format the data. So you'll see here you can do regular currency, you can do percentages, you can do a standard, it's just regular numbers. And then you also have some custom formatting here as well on the bottom where I can tell it I want to format this as a currency, but I want to have 0 decimal places, for example. So I have optionally here with this custom formatting, I can remove things I don't like. Maybe perhaps I want to round up to no decimal places. I can come in here and actually remove the decimal places so they don't show up to my users if I so desire to. So there's some really neat things that you can do in here to be able to impact how your users see the data. Okay, I'm going to process this one more time. Again, I'll go ahead and just do deploy, and that'll do the process of the data as well if I needed to make any new data changes. And what we'll see now when I've made this change is we'll now see inside my browser window, okay, once I reconnect, we'll see inside my browser window a new folder that we've created. Okay, so you'll see a new folder in here called revenue. And I can drill into that folder. By the way, you see that in Excel as well. I can drill into that folder and then find the certain metrics that have to do with revenue. So it helps with organization very easily. Now, if I did apply formatting to this metric, but I'll go ahead and tell you, I believe this UI that we're looking at right now does not show that formatting. No, actually it does. That's order quantity though. So this one is not showing the formatting. I think I did the formatting on sales amounts. And it does not. Yeah, it's just this one UI. This browser UI does not pick up the formatting, but if I were to analyze in Excel, it does show you all the formatting that we applied there. All right. Well, I have about 5 minutes left, and I do want to save some time for questions. I will mention this. A couple things for you. Here's my sales shtick for you. I told you I run training here for Pragmatic Works. We do offer a full analysis services class. If you're interested in this, I got you a little taste of what it's like and you want to learn more about it, we have a week-long course about it. We also have a course that we're going to have in Omaha, Nebraska. If you want to pay a visit to Omaha, we have a workshop that we're going to be doing there this month, actually June 24th, that you can come and visit me. I will actually be there, and I'm going to be presenting on all of Analysis Services, not only multidimensional, but also tabular in 2 days. 2 full days of Analysis Services, multidimensional, tabular, as well as Power Pivot, all in that same 2 days. You can also do the virtual training, which focuses in on those individual tools. All right, Liz, that's all new content I have. Do you have any questions queued up, ready to go?
Yep. You ready?
All right. I'm ready for you.
All right. This is an example of Microsoft, but in real-time dimension where you have multiple keys in a dimension. How do you assign multiple key in the dimension?
Okay, great question. Yeah, so this was a very simple example, but oftentimes you'll be relating tables that have multiple key columns. You can certainly do that. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. So you can have multiple key columns inside of a dimension. Works just fine. Not a problem.
Okay. Should you always process the dimensions before processing the entire cube?
Good question. So there is a bit of an order of operations when it comes to processing, and it mainly has to do with dependencies that you have. So, for example, most of my dimensions, or actually I should say my measure group or my fact table has dependencies on the dimensions. So yes, usually when you tell it to process the entire thing, the entire cube, or the entire database I should say, it is smart enough to do the correct order. It's smart enough to know that the dimensions have to be processed first. So short answer is yes, dimensions have to be processed first before the measure groups or before the cube. But oftentimes, if you tell it to process the whole thing, it'll automatically do that. One quick add to that is generally with a very large cube, you're not just freewheeling, processing everything all the time. So you have to be careful sometimes with how you process things. And that gets into another discussion of partitioning out the data. There's a lot of discussions we can have and strategy there for how you can do that.
Okay. Can you talk briefly about KPIs, aggregations, and perspectives?
Wow. Okay. Briefly. So KPIs are key performance indicators. Those are basically like the red light, green light. How's my company doing in a certain metric? So an example of this would be, I want to see how my sales are doing this year over last year's sales, and I want to have a little indicator on my screen, usually in Excel, that lights up in green or red or yellow, depending on whatever my goal. Did I beat my goal or not? Now, those are all written using MDX. You'll notice that I didn't show you any MDX in this hour because we actually have a week-long course that we spend on MDX. So if you're interested in that as well, we do teach MDX. But that's all based off MDX if you're doing KPIs. Aggregations. Aggregations was another tab that we had inside of our cube. Aggregations are basically ways that you can tell Analysis Services individual attributes that your users like to use a lot. So if your users analyze data a lot by year, then you can create specific aggregations that store that information and allow, it's basically like an index. Here's a good analogy. If you've done indexes in SQL Server, it's kind of like an index. It doesn't work exactly the same, but that's the best analogy I can give you for how Analysis Services aggregations work. And what was the last one, Liz?
Perspectives. Perspectives.
Perspectives. Gotcha. So perspectives are used for the very large cubes also. Not for the same reasons, though. Not for performance reasons. So here's what perspectives help you with. With very large cubes that have a lot of different objects, meaning a lot of different tables that you're using, with very large cubes, it can oftentimes be confusing to users to find the things they care about. So let's say, for example, you created one cube that has all of the information for your entire company. So it has HR data in it, it has sales data in it, it has inventory data in it, it has all marketing, all that stuff is in one single cube. Now, if that's the case, it can make it really difficult for your users to find the things they actually care about. So what perspectives do is it allows them to look at a filtered view of the cube for them. It only shows them the objects that they care about. So I might create a sales perspective that shows me just my tables that have to do with sales. I can create a marketing one that just shows me my marketing tables, and then it allows me to get to the things I care about faster. Now, it's not a way of doing security. It's just a usability enhancement. It just makes it so it's easier for them to find the things they care about. because they can all, if you do perspective, they can always look at the entire cube if they want to, but it allows them the option to go look at just the things they care about.
Okay. Do you have to worry about partitioning, archiving, index tuning, etc. for a cube as it grows over time?
Yeah, you definitely do. So one of the things that I'll mention here right now is I always, I don't think I've missed on this, I always write a follow-up blog. So you'll see my blog site here on the screen, devinicesql.com. Usually within the next couple days, I'll write a follow-up blog to some of these questions. These are really good questions. By the way, I have to say that. But these are really good questions, and well, I'm joking. I really want to be able to actually make sure I can answer all of them. So if you do have some extra questions here at the end, I do try to write a follow-up blog. Now, the last one is a pretty loaded question as well. Yes, you're definitely concerned about partitions and aggregations with larger cubes. The reason I mentioned my blog is because I actually have, and I will direct you to, in my follow-up blog post to this webinar, is a couple articles that I've written that help you and guide you through creating partitions and aggregations, and I have several different articles that help you with that. So I'll direct you to those if you take a look at my blog. Within the next week, I'll have a post on the webinar. So that's certainly an important thing to do, and I'll direct you to some articles that I'll give you some more supplemental material there.
Okay, we have several more questions. Are you okay with that, Devin?
Sure, let's do one more.
Okay. For the
like I said, I'll write a follow blog on the others.
Okay. For the display folder, do you need to create the folder first somewhere, or is it only in the properties of the dimension?
Yeah, so display folders are just, it was actually display folders are in the cube. So any metric that you have, you can put in the display folder. You don't necessarily have to create them ahead of time. You can create them on the fly. So as you're developing your cube, you can create a display folder just by typing in a name, and then assuming that you type that same exact name on another measure, it'll put that other measure into that same display folder. If you happen to make a spelling mistake or you type it differently, it's going to create a new folder that allows you to separate those metrics into separate folders. One other thing about that, you can actually nest folders. So if you put a slash in there, you can actually have multiple folders that are nested within each other if you choose to.